18. Celebrities who kept a secret lover until the day they died. Hollywood sold audiences perfect romances, but some of its biggest stars were hiding relationships that could have destroyed careers, marriages, and carefully built public images. A few secrets stayed buried for decades. Others surfaced only after death. Subscribe to Classic Hollywood Legends and discover the love stories Hollywood never wanted you to know. Anthony Perkins' Tab Hunter. Anthony Perkins became one of Hollywood's recognizable leading men. But during the 1950s, a relationship in his life had to remain hidden. Before Psycho made Perkins forever famous as Norman Bates, he was romantically involved with fellow heartthrob Tab Hunter, then one of Warner Brothers' biggest stars. Hunter later said their relationship lasted roughly 2 years, although he knew Perkins for about 3. They attended premieres, movies, and other events together, sometimes using double dates as cover. Hunter recalled that he might wear a baseball cap and sunglasses, and the two often arrived separately. At a time when being openly gay could threaten a leading man's career, discretion was not simply a preference, it was protection. Could you imagine becoming one of Hollywood's most desired young stars, while knowing that being seen with the person you loved could damage everything you had built? Their relationship eventually ended as their careers moved in different directions. Perkins remained at Paramount, while Hunter was under contract at Warner Brothers, and both were constantly working. Perkins later married photographer Barry Berenson in 1973 and became the father of 2 sons. For decades, the relationship with Hunter stayed outside the public story surrounding Perkins. Hunter finally discussed it openly in his 2005 memoir, Tab Hunter Confidential, and later in interviews and a documentary. By then, Perkins had been dead for 13 years. He died in 1992 from AIDS-related complications at 60, having never publicly discussed his sexuality. What once had to be hidden for survival eventually became part of Hollywood's closeted history. Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher. For nearly 40 years, one of Star Wars' biggest off-screen secrets remained known only to the people involved. While filming the original movie in 1976, Carrie Fisher began a 3-month affair with Harrison Ford, the man playing Han Solo opposite her Princess Leia. Fisher was 19. Ford was 33, married to Mary Marquardt, and already the father of 2 children. In her 2016 memoir, The Princess Diarist, Fisher finally described what had happened between them, drawing partly from journals she had kept during filming. She remembered the relationship as intense but emotionally confusing, especially because she was so young and inexperienced. How do you keep working beside someone every day when the relationship has to disappear the moment the cameras stop? According to Fisher, the affair lasted through the Star Wars shoot and ended when production finished. For decades, she repeatedly avoided confirming the rumors, allowing fans to believe that Han and Leia's chemistry existed only on screen. Ford also kept the matter completely private at the time. Before publishing her memoir, Fisher said she warned him and sent him a draft, but he did not publicly address the story when it became news. The revelation arrived in November 2016, just weeks before Fisher's death that December. By then, Star Wars had become one of cinema's most famous franchises, and Han Solo and Princess Leia were among its most beloved couples. What audiences had watched as fictional tension in 1977 therefore carried a private history. No one outside their circle fully understood for almost 4 decades. Kim Novak, Sammy Davis Jr. Kim Novak was already one of Columbia Pictures' brightest stars when she began a private relationship with Sammy Davis Jr. in the late 1950s. Novak was white, Davis was black, and in an era when interracial relationships could provoke backlash, simply being seen together threatened both careers. They first met in 1956, and their romance developed quietly over the following year. Davis visited Novak while she was filming Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, and they spent holidays together, but public appearances were rare. When gossip columnist Dorothy Kilgallen exposed the relationship, in 1958, Columbia executives reportedly panicked over what the scandal could do to Novak's image. Would you have risked your career to continue seeing someone Hollywood had told you was off-limits? The pressure became severe. Accounts published years later claimed Columbia chief Harry Cohn used underworld contacts to threaten Davis unless the relationship ended. Davis soon entered a short-lived marriage to dancer Lorraine White, widely described as an attempt to calm the controversy. Novak publicly denied the romance at the time. Decades later, however, she spoke openly about what Davis had meant to her. Novak said she did not consider the relationship scandalous and remembered him as someone she genuinely cared about. She also said they shared a desire to be accepted for who they were, rather than judged by appearance. Gregory Peck, Ingrid Bergman. Gregory Peck was rising quickly in Hollywood when Alfred Hitchcock cast him opposite Ingrid Bergman in the 1945 thriller Spellbound. Their on-screen romance became one of the film's defining elements. But decades later, Peck acknowledged that their connection had extended beyond the cameras. At the time, both stars were married. Peck had wed Greta Kukkonen in 1942, while Bergman was married to physician Petter Lindstrom. During production, they spent weeks working together, and biographers later described the relationship as a brief affair. Peck himself remained guarded. In a 1987 interview 5 years after Bergman's death, he admitted that he had felt real love for her, but refused to give intimate details. How difficult must it have been to return home each night while sharing that kind of private connection with a co-star under Hollywood's constant scrutiny? The Peck-Bergman story remained largely outside the public record for more than 4 decades. Even when Peck finally spoke about it, he chose restraint rather than confession. That silence is part of what makes the story intriguing. 2 admired stars shared an intimacy that audiences watching Spellbound in 1945 had no reason to publicly suspect. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mildred Baena. Arnold Schwarzenegger built his public image around discipline, first as a bodybuilding champion, then as one of Hollywood's biggest action stars and governor of California. But one part of his private life remained hidden for years during his marriage to Maria Shriver. He had an affair with Mildred Baena, a longtime member of the family's household staff. The affair occurred in 1996 at the Schwarzenegger family home, while Shriver and the children were away. Baena later gave birth to Joseph Baena. For years, Joseph's paternity was not known, and Schwarzenegger later said he himself did not immediately realize that Joseph was his son. As the boy grew older, however, the resemblance became increasingly difficult to ignore. How would you face your family after a secret kept for more than a decade finally became impossible to hide? In January 2011, during a counseling session, Shriver directly asked Schwarzenegger whether he had fathered Baena's child. He admitted the truth. The couple separated that year after 25 years of marriage, and Shriver filed for divorce in July. Their divorce was not finalized until 2021. Schwarzenegger later called the affair one of the biggest mistakes of his life and acknowledged the pain it caused Shriver and their children. Yet he also built a relationship with Joseph, who has spoken about his father while pursuing bodybuilding and acting. Gene Roddenberry, Nichelle Nichols. Gene Roddenberry was still years away from creating Star Trek when Nichelle Nichols entered his life. Nichols met the television producer while working on his series The Lieutenant in the 1960s, and what began as friendship became a romantic relationship. Roddenberry was married at the time, making the relationship something neither could discuss openly. Nichols later wrote about the affair in her 1994 memoir, Beyond Uhura. She made one point: the romance had ended long before Star Trek began, and by the time she was playing Lieutenant Uhura, she and Roddenberry were only friends and colleagues. She also recalled discovering that Roddenberry was involved with actress Majel Barrett, who later became his second wife. What would it be like to work closely with someone who had once been your secret lover, while almost everyone around you knew nothing about that history? Nichols said she chose to end the relationship rather than remain caught in a situation involving Barrett and Roddenberry's existing marriage. Despite that history, she continued to speak of Roddenberry with affection and respect, particularly for the opportunities he created for black performers through Star Trek. For decades, most fans knew Nichols only as Uhura and Roddenberry, as the visionary behind the franchise. Their earlier relationship became widely known only after Nichols chose to describe it herself, revealing a private chapter from that had ended before Star Trek reached television. Raymond Burr, Robert Benevides. Raymond Burr became one of television's most authoritative stars as defense attorney Perry Mason, but the private life he presented publicly was very different from the one he actually lived. Behind the scenes, Burr shared more than 3 decades with actor and producer Robert Benevides, a relationship known mainly to trusted friends while Burr was alive. The two met through Perry Mason and eventually built a life together away from Hollywood publicity. Benevides became Burr's business partner as well as his companion, and together they operated an orchid nursery, a production company, and a vineyard in Northern California. Burr also maintained a retreat in Fiji, where the pair could live with less scrutiny. Could you imagine spending more than 30 years with the person closest to you, while knowing that openly acknowledging the relationship might damage the career you had built? For much of his career, Burr described a complicated personal history involving several marriages and a son. After his death, biographers found that parts of those stories could not be substantiated, while his relationship with Benevides became more widely known. Burr died of cancer in September 1993 at 76, with Benevides among those closest to him. Burr left much of his estate to Benevides, who continued their vineyard and later renamed it in the actor's honor. Their story became one of the clearest examples of how carefully Hollywood stars once guarded their private lives. Gary Cooper, Patricia Neal. Gary Cooper was already one of Hollywood's biggest leading men when Patricia Neal met him while making The Fountainhead in the late 1940s. Cooper was married to Veronica Rocky Cooper and was 25 years older than Neal, but their on-screen chemistry developed into a relationship that Neal later described as one of the great loves of her life. The affair continued for several years and became increasingly difficult to hide. Cooper temporarily separated from his wife, while Neal found herself caught in a scandal that damaged her standing in Hollywood. The situation became more painful when Neal became pregnant. She later wrote that she and Cooper agreed she would have an abortion, a decision she regretted for the rest of her life. How do you walk away from someone you still love when staying together is hurting almost everyone around you? Decades later, Neal spoke openly about Cooper in her 1988 autobiography, As I Am. She never rewrote the relationship as a happy Hollywood romance. Cooper had been married, people were hurt, and the ending devastated her. Yet years later, Neal still described him with extraordinary affection, revealing how deeply that relationship had shaped her life. James Dean, William Bast. James Dean became a symbol of youthful rebellion after East of Eden Rebel. Without a cause and giant, but part of his private life surfaced only decades after his death. Screenwriter William Bast, who met Dean while both were studying at UCLA in 1950, later said their friendship became sexual and romantic. The two were roommates in Los Angeles and New York, sharing years of Dean's life before Hollywood turned him into an icon. Bast published James Dean, a biography, in 1956, a year after Dean died, but left out the most intimate parts of their relationship. At the time, Bast was still closeted, and later admitted that fear and the social climate of the 1950s shaped what he was willing to reveal. How much of your own life would you hide if telling the truth could destroy your career and the reputation of someone you loved? Half a century later, Bast told a fuller version in his 2006 memoir, Surviving James Dean. He described a friendship that crossed into intimacy while resisting simplistic labels for Dean's sexuality. Bast wrote that Dean had relationships with both men and women and was still figuring out his identity when he died. Dean was killed in a car crash in 1955 at 24, so he never had the chance to confirm or challenge Bast's account. Their story, therefore, remains Bast's testimony rather than a relationship Dean publicly acknowledged. Jim Nabor's Stan Cadwallader. Nabors met Stan Cadwallader in Honolulu in 1975 when Cadwallader was working as a firefighter. The two became partners and stayed together for decades, but Nabors never discussed the relationship publicly. He later explained that close friends and co-workers knew he was gay. He simply considered the subject personal rather than something he wanted turned into a public spectacle. Would you have imagined that one of television's familiar stars had shared his life with the same man for nearly 4 decades without fans knowing? That changed in January 2013. After same-sex marriage became legal in Washington state, Nabors and Cadwallader traveled from Hawaii to Seattle and married in a hotel ceremony before a judge. Nabors was 82. Cadwallader was 64. The marriage did not begin their relationship. It legally recognized one that had already lasted 38 years. Nabors said he felt blessed to have had such a long-time partner. He remained with Cadwallader until his death in 2017 at age 87. Farley Granger, Leonard Bernstein. Farley Granger became one of Hollywood's striking young leading men through Alfred Hitchcock's Rope and Strangers on a Train. But long after those films made him famous, Granger revealed that his private life had been far more complicated than the image studios sold to audiences. In his 2007 memoir, Include Me Out, written with longtime partner Robert Calhoun Granger, spoke openly about being bisexual and described relationships with both men and women. Among the names he discussed was composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein, with whom Granger said he had an affair years earlier. How different would Hollywood history look if stars of that era had been able to speak openly about whom they loved without fearing what it might do to their careers? Granger later said he did not believe he was outing Bernstein by writing about the relationship, noting that Bernstein's relationships with men were already known within certain circles. What made the revelation significant was how long such stories had remained outside the public version of Golden Age Hollywood. Granger's memoir also discussed romances with Patricia Neal Shelley Winters, Ava Gardner, and playwright Arthur Laurents. By the time he published the book, he was in his 80s and no longer interested in preserving the carefully controlled image studios had once created around him. George Takei Brad Altman. George Takei became known as Hikaru Sulu on Star Trek. But for most of his career, one important relationship in his life remained outside the public eye. He met Brad Altman in the 1980s through a gay running club in Los Angeles, and the two soon became partners. By 2005, they had already been together for 18 years. Friends and relatives knew about this relationship, but Takei had never discussed his sexuality with the press. He later explained that growing up gay in an earlier era had taught him to fear what exposure might mean for his career. How difficult would it be to share nearly 2 decades with someone you loved, while millions of fans knew almost nothing about that part of your life? Takei finally came out publicly in October 2005, saying the political climate around same-sex marriage helped push him to speak. Once the secret was public, he became increasingly active in LGBTQ+ advocacy. 3 years later, after California's Supreme Court cleared the way for same-sex marriage, Take and Altman announced their engagement. They married in Los Angeles in September 2008. What had once been carefully kept private became one of Take's most public and enduring partnerships, a relationship that had already survived nearly 20 years before most fans even knew it existed. Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn. Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn created one of classic Hollywood's most famous screen partnerships, but their off-screen relationship was kept out of public view for more than 2 decades. They met while making Woman of the Year in 1941 and went on to appear together in 9 films, including Adam's Rib Pat and Mike and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Their relationship was complicated from the beginning because Tracy was already married to Louise Treadwell Tracy. Although the couple lived apart for long periods, he never divorced her. Tracy was a devout Catholic, and biographers have noted that his faith family obligations and the strict morality expectations surrounding major stars contributed to the secrecy. Hepburn and Tracy maintained separate homes and were rarely photographed behaving publicly as a couple. How difficult would it be to spend more than 20 years loving someone while knowing the relationship could never be acknowledged openly? Hepburn later wrote candidly about how deeply she loved Tracy, explaining that she adjusted parts of herself to suit him and would have done almost anything for him. Their professional chemistry continued until the end. They made Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in 1967 during a period when Tracy's health was declining. Tracy died on June 10, 1967, only weeks after filming ended. Hepburn did not attend his funeral, reportedly out of consideration for his wife and family. During Tracy's lifetime, she never publicly confirmed the relationship. Only decades later, especially through Hepburn's 1991 autobiography, Me Stories of My Life, did the public receive her own account of the bond that had shaped such a large part of both their lives. Richard Chamberlain, Martin Rabbett. Richard Chamberlain spent decades playing the kind of romantic leading man television audiences adored. Behind that carefully protected image, however, he was building a private life with actor and producer Martin Rabbett. The two began their relationship in 1977 and eventually settled together in Hawaii. In 2003, Chamberlain said they had already been together for 26 years and had held a commitment ceremony roughly 2 decades earlier, creating their own vows with close friends present. Yet throughout the height of his fame, the relationship remained largely outside his public identity. How exhausting must it have been to share a life with someone for decades while knowing that acknowledging the relationship could threaten the career that supported you both? Chamberlain finally came out publicly in 2003 with his memoir, Shattered Love. He explained that during his years as the heartthrob of Dr. Kildare Shogun and the Thorn Birds, he believed revealing that he was gay could destroy the romantic image studios and audiences expected him to maintain. By then, he no longer felt that fear had the same power over him. Chamberlain and Rabbett eventually separated amicably around 2010, but they remained close for years afterward. When Chamberlain died in Hawaii in March 2025 at age 90, Rabbett announced the loss, calling him his lifelong partner and writing that their love had not ended with death. Liberace Scott Thorson. Liberace built a career around extravagance, but one part of his life remained carefully hidden from the public. In 1976, he met Scott Thorson, a teenager, who later said he became the pianist's live-in companion, chauffeur, and lover. Their relationship lasted several years behind the glittering stage persona Liberace presented to audiences. Thorson later claimed that Liberace brought him into a world of luxury, expensive gifts, and constant travel. He also alleged that the entertainer encouraged him to undergo cosmetic surgery so that his face would resemble a younger version of Liberace. By the early 1980s, however, the relationship had deteriorated badly. How do you separate love from power when one person controls the money, the home, and almost every part of the other person's life? In 1982, Thorson filed a highly publicized palimony lawsuit seeking more than $100 million and claiming Liberace had promised long-term financial support. Liberace denied the allegations. The case dragged on for years before the two sides reached a settlement in 1986 for $95,000. The lawsuit forced a relationship Liberace had tried to keep private into public view, even though he never publicly came out as gay during his lifetime. He died from AIDS-related illness in 1987. A year later, Thorson published Behind the Candelabra, giving his version of their relationship in detail. Decades afterward, the memoir became the basis for the 2013 HBO film, starring Michael Douglas and Matt Damon for a global audience. Marlon Brando, Rita Moreno. Marlon Brando was one of Hollywood's most magnetic actors when Rita Moreno met him while making Desiree in 1954. Moreno was 22. Brando was 7 years older, and their relationship became an intense on and off affair that she later said lasted about 8 years. For Moreno, the attraction was overwhelming, but the relationship was also painful. In interviews and her memoir, she described Brando as repeatedly unfaithful and emotionally destructive. At one point, she became pregnant. Moreno later, Brando pressured her to have an abortion, an experience she remembered as physically and emotionally traumatic. How do you separate love from harm when the person you cannot stop returning to is also the person causing much of your pain? The relationship eventually pushed Moreno to a breaking point. She has spoken openly about attempting suicide during that period, explaining that she was trying to end the part of herself that kept going back to Brando. She survived, continued therapy, and ultimately ended the cycle. Years later, Moreno still refused to reduce the relationship to a simple Hollywood romance. She described Brando as the lust of her life while calling her husband, Leonard Gordon, the love of her life. Their story remained part of Moreno's private history for decades before she discussed it openly in interviews and her 2013 memoir. What emerged was not a glamorous secret affair, but a relationship she remembered as passionate, addictive, and damaging. Rock Hudson, Lee Garlington. Rock Hudson became one of Hollywood's defining romantic leading men, but the image audiences saw on screen was very different from the life he had to protect in private. In 1962, at the height of his fame, he met Lee Garlington, then a young film extra. Their relationship developed quietly and lasted until 1965. Garlington later recalled that secrecy was simply understood. Hudson never needed to demand it because both men knew being openly gay could destroy a major star's career. They sometimes attended premieres with women as their dates arrived separately and avoided being photographed together. On one vacation to Puerto Vallarta, they could finally relax away from Hollywood and live, as Garlington later described it, like an ordinary couple. How difficult must it have been to love someone while knowing that one careless photograph could threaten an entire career? Their relationship ended in 1965, and the two eventually lost contact. When Hudson's AIDS diagnosis became public in 1985, Garlington tried to reach him, but was told Hudson was already too ill to recognize visitors. Hudson died that October at 59. Years later came the revelation Garlington had never expected. In the posthumously published biography, Rock Hudson, His Story, Hudson reportedly described Garlington as his true love. Garlington later said he broke down in tears when he read it, because he had never realized how deeply Hudson had felt. What had once been hidden for survival became part of the public record decades later, revealing a relationship that Hollywood's famous romantic hero had never been free to acknowledge openly.